Gunfire cracked like whips through the treaty camp, tearing the stillness into shreds of screams and smoke, and she ran. Barefoot, breath slashing her throat raw, skirts snatching at her knees as the white silk of her wedding dress dragged through dust that stank of blood and burning sage. Behind her, men shouted names in two tongues, boots pounding, rifles snarling in the dark, and the world pitched sideways as the firelight stuttered over torn banners and bodies splayed like broken dolls on the trampled earth. She didn't look back. Couldn't. The vow they meant to bind her with lay shredded like the hem that now streamed behind her, its purity ripped by fists, its promise ground into grit when the shooting started, and the men who toasted peace turned savage with greed. She hurdled a fallen drum, the beaded hide split and bleeding sand, and kept running until her lungs burned and her legs screamed mutiny, until the cottonwood swallowed her in a snarl of black limbs and silvered frost, and only then did she collapse, knees gouging the earth, fists clutching dirt as if the land could hide her. Her dress was no longer white, but a map of ruin, ragged from claws of stone, smeared red where someone's blood wasn't hers but clung like guilt, and in the torn seams her skin flashed pale as a secret she couldn't defend. Breath ragged, she tore at the bodice with trembling fingers, meaning to rip it clean and run half-naked if it bought her a mile more, but a shadow slid over the moon and stilled her hands. He came soundless, stepping from the timber like a ghost raised by wind, lean and straight, hair bound in a braid black as the night's spine. Rifle slung easy as breath along his back, knife hilt winking frost at his hip. A Lakota scout. She knew it by the beadwork flashing at his wrist, by the way his moccasins kissed the ground without taking sound, by the silence in his eyes, deep as river stone. Her throat locked, and fear rattled her ribs like dice in a gambler's fist, because if the bluecoats found her first, they'd claim her as property. But if this man chose blood for blood, she'd feed the earth before dawn. He said nothing, just looked at her where she knelt with dust smeared across her cheek like war paint, white dress yawning open in strips, her breath sawing hard, while his shadow stretched long enough to bind her like rope. Then he knelt too, slow, deliberate, boots whispering in the dead grass, and when his hands came up she flinched, waiting for steel. But what glinted wasn't a blade, it was a bone-handled needle threaded with sinew, fine as hair, and his voice when it broke, the hush was low, husky, carved from smoke and storm. Hold still. She froze as his fingers, warm and calloused, found the torn edge at her shoulder and drew it close, the thread whispering through silk in strokes sure as heartbeat, pulling ruin back into shape. Not for beauty, not for show, but for some law older than either of them. His head bent close, breath ghosting her skin, and in the raw cradle of moonlight she saw his eyes, black fire smoldering with something that wasn't pity, wasn't desire, but a vow spoken in silence. What they tore, I mend, what they break, I guard. The world narrowed to the tug of sinew, the scrape of wind, the thunder of hooves far off like a storm hunting its name. And with every stitch she felt the ground tilt, felt fate crouch low between them, teeth bared, waiting for the first scream to split the dark again. The wind carried the stink of smoke and iron through the timber long before the first hoofbeats rolled low like thunder under ice. And Clara, she still thought of herself by that name, though tonight had stripped her down to bone and nerve, felt her breath hitch as the Lakota scout's fingers stilled on the last stitch, his head lifting like a wolf catching the scent of men who hunt without hunger. His gaze cut through the black, reading shapes the moon hadn't yet spilled, and then he rose in a ripple of shadow, silent but for the click of a rifle bolt sliding home, a sound that throbbed against her spine like a drum summoning something older than law. She scrambled to her feet, skirts dragging, the mended seams tight against her ribs as if to remind her she was still flesh, still breathing. Though the night had teeth and every second bared them wider. He turned to her once, eyes black as a river mouth swallowing stars, and pressed the bone needle into her palm, curling her fingers around it until the point bit skin. "Thread's done," his voice rasped, low as gravel under frost. "Now you hold what comes after." Then he vanished into the dark, a ripple swallowed by cedar and shadow, and the silence he left behind felt heavier than the sound of boots closing in. Clara crouched low, knife edge of fear scraping her ribs, pulse a wild thing as she peered through a lattice of branches at the glow swelling on the horizon. Torches, flaring like devil eyes, throwing up sparks that licked the night as riders poured out of the gulch, their silhouettes long and lean as lies. She counted 6, maybe 7, guns slung loose, mouths grinning wide enough to drink the cold whole, and in their lead rode a man with a coat black as a crow's wing and a badge pinned crooked, catching moonlight in a wink that felt like a blade pressed to the throat of truth. Her breath stuttered when his voice knifed through the dark, smooth and smiling like a card, sharp flipping death from a deck. "Bride in white! Don't make us scuff those pretty stitches." The men laughed, low and filthy, and the sound crawled under her skin like frostbite, burning as it spread. Clara's fingers locked on the needle until blood slicked her grip, and she thought, God help her, that if they came for her, she'd drive that sliver of bone through an eye before she let their hands tear what the Lakota's thread had made whole. A gunshot cracked, sudden as lightning, splitting a torch clean in two, and chaos howled loose as men swung down from saddles, boots spitting snow, rifles jerking up like iron fangs. The scout moved through them like smoke with teeth, silent until the rifle coughed fire that split a man's chest wide and painted the drifts in black bloom. Clara bit her fist to smother a cry, the needle biting deeper as her eyes drank the blur of motion. Muzzle flares strobing trees, snow exploding under boots, blood trailing in ribbons across the white world like ink spilled on scripture. Another shot ripped the dark. A man screamed, high and raw, and then rough hands wrenched her backward, jerking the breath out of her chest. She hit the ground hard, stars bursting behind her eyes, and before she could claw air, a voice bent low, hot and foul against her ear. "He ain't stitching you back this time, sweetheart." She gagged on panic, thrashing wild, until steel glinted an inch from her face, and the badge man crouched, grin sharp as a trap sprung in the dark. "Thread or throat, darlin'? Which one snaps first?" The torchlight bled across the snow like spilled fire, glinting off gun barrels as the badge man's grin carved wider, his knife edge kissing her throat with a chill that burned like ice dipped in flame. Clara froze, breath trapped under her ribs, heart pounding like a miner's hammer in a hollow shaft, while his words slid through the smoke. "Thread or throat, darlin'? Which one snaps first?" She felt the needle biting her palm, bone point slick with her own blood, and in the half-second his eyes flicked toward the shadows, hunting for the scout who'd vanished like breath. She struck. The needle drove up under his jaw, not deep enough to kill, but sharp enough to draw a howl that cracked the night. He reeled, blade flashing wide, and Clara scrambled sideways, skirts ripping anew as snow clawed her knees. Lungs clawing air that burned like whiskey poured on raw flesh. Gunfire tore open the dark in the same heartbeat, a volley snarling from the ridge, and men scattered like spooked wolves as the Lakota scout came out of the timber like judgment draped in shadows, rifle barking fire, muzzle flash strobing his face into something savage and carved from stone. One man dropped screaming, blood writing its confession across the drifts. Another spun with a hole through his gut, eyes wide as coins before they glazed to frost. Clara crawled hard for the cottonwood snag, splinters biting her palms, but boots thundered behind her and a fist like an iron shackle slammed her down, grinding her cheek into the snow until she tasted dirt and blood tangled on her tongue. The weight crushed the air out of her, and the stench of sweat and powder scoured her nose as the voice above growled, low and hungry, "Got you now, little bride." A gunstock cracked bone close to her ear, jerking her vision white, and she thought, "This is the last page, this is how it ends," until a shadow loomed and fire roared point blank. The weight vanished, blown off her by force enough to rattle teeth, and when her sight cleared, he was there, the scout, eyes black as riverstone, breath pluming like smoke from a forge as he hauled her up by the wrist. "Move," his voice rasped, rough as a rawhide lash, and before she could find words, he was dragging her through the crimson churn, where bodies twitched and torches guttered in slush, his knife a silver whisper carving any hand that clawed their way. Behind them, the badgeman's roar ripped up like thunder split from the earth, his shadow staggering after, blood streaking his jaw, gun raised in a fist slick with rage. "You run him!" he bellowed. "You run him and I'll cut you open for every stitch he laid." Shots screamed past, chewing bark, spitting snow in hard white sprays as they plunged into the timber where black trunks slashed the moonlight into blades. Clara's lungs clawed fire, her pulse a drum gone mad, the needle still in her fist like a talisman soaked in sin, and through the roar of blood and wind she heard the scout's breath break like glass on steel as he growled against the dark. "They won't stop now. They want what's sown in you worse than life, and they'll burn half the West to rip it out." The trees swallowed them whole, darkness thick as tar between their trunks, and Clara's breath came in knives as the Lakota scout dragged her through drifts that clawed her skirts and clung like hands trying to drag her back into the jaws of fire. Behind them the night tore with shouts, boots splintering branches, the badgeman's voice boiling up like smoke from hell. "Bring her back, breathing. Don't mark the face. We need it seen when the papers print." The words sliced colder than the wind, sharper than the stitch still slick in her fist, and something in her gut curdled into dread so deep it rooted through bone. She stumbled hard, the scout jerking her up before her knees hit, his grip burning through the frostbite in her arm, his voice ragged as a rope worn thin. "Move, white dress, or die where you drop." They crashed through a snarl of brush, snow spraying like glass shards under their boots, until he flung her against the belly of an upturned oak, crouched low, rifle angled across his thighs, eyes cutting the black like a panther's blade. She pressed against bark, chest heaving, lips split and salted with blood, her mind clawing for sense. But the words wouldn't stop clawing louder. "What's sown in you worse than life?" Her hand rose, trembling, to the bodice where the mended seam pinched tight over her heart, where the scout's sinew thread pulled ruin back to shape. "What did you put in here?" she rasped, and his head turned, eyes glinting under the slash of moon like flint-spitting sparks. "Didn't put," he said, voice low, grave deep, "pulled out." Her breath hitched sharp as ice. "Pulled out what?" He stared a beat too long, jaw tight enough to crack, then flicked his gaze toward the east where the pines serrated the horizon like black teeth. "Those men don't hunt women. They hunt proof. You're wearing the last treaty west of the river, stitched in silk by hands that thought paper was too easy to burn." Clara's stomach pitched hard, bile slick at the back of her tongue as the pieces fell jagged into place, the rush to marry before dusk, the whispers at the edge of the fire, the bride price that wasn't silver but secrets inked in words carved deep enough to bleed law itself. She clutched the fabric, felt the seam like a scar pressed close to bone, and every heartbeat roared with the truth. They didn't want her dress for shame. They wanted it for war. Voices flared closer, torches spitting orange through the trees. Gunmetal glints winking between the trunks like eyes gone rabid, and the scout rose slow, shoulders loose, death quiet on his breath as he chambered around with a click, soft as a coffin lid closing. "You tear that seam," he rasped without looking at her, "and you don't live to finish the rip." Clara swallowed fire and fear, fingers curling from the stitch like it burned, and in the space where her pulse should be she felt something colder coil. A vow that if the West wanted blood for ink, she'd bleed steel before she let them write her name in it. The wind knifed through the pines and brought the stink of burning pitch before the first torch glared through the dark like a devil's eye, its glow licking over rifles and teeth as the men fanned out, boots crunching frost with the slow hunger of wolves circling meat they'd already tasted. Clara flattened against the uprooted oak, breath sawing fire through her throat, fingers fisted in the skirt where the cursed seam cut her ribs, and every thread felt like a fuse burning under her skin. The scout crouched in shadow, one palm splayed on the ground like he could feel death humming through the roots, his other hand curled tight on the rifle, eyes black slits of flint under a spill of moonlight. When he spoke, it was smoke barely shaped into sound. "They'll sweep the hollow first. 2 heartbeats, maybe 3. Then blood." Clara wanted to ask whose, but the question tangled and died because the badgeman's voice ripped through the trees like a whip of oil and fire. "White dress. Come sweet now and maybe we let him keep his scalp." Laughter cracked, jagged and mean, spitting sparks off the frozen dark as the men split, torches wagging their orange tongues, shadows leaping across bark like spirits clawing for skin. The scout's grip clamped her wrist sudden, dragging her low, shoving her belly flat into the snow where the cold slapped her breath clean and left her raw as he slid the knife into her palm, hilt warm from his heat, his whisper carving a scar into her bones. "If they take you breathing, the treaty burns and the prairie with it. You understand?" She nodded, teeth cutting her lip until blood salted her tongue. And then the world fractured. A twig snapped like a bone breaking, torchlight swelled, and a boot crunched so close the earth shuddered under her cheek. She held breath tight enough to split her ribs as a man bent, his shadow lashing long, the stink of whiskey crawling down her throat. And then the scout rose behind him, a wraith with fire in his fists, and drove the rifle butt through the skull so hard it cracked like green wood in a frost fire. The man dropped boneless, torch spitting in the drift, and hell broke loose. Gunfire tore the dark into ribbons of flame, bullets whining through timber, bark exploding into splinters that bit Clara's face as she rolled, skirts whipping, knife clamped like a promise between her teeth. A body lunged, boots snarling slush, hand clawing for her hair, and she spun, the blade punching low and mean into the meat of his thigh. He howled, his colt jerking wild, muzzle flash strobing the trees before the scout's second shot split his roar into silence. Another shadow came howling out of smoke, badge winking fire as the leader swung a shotgun like judgment and bellowed, "She's mine!" His blast chewed the log where her head had been, snow erupting in a geyser of splinters, and Clara crawled for the roots, heart ramming bone, until a hand seized her ankle and yanked her screaming into the open where fire glazed the snow, and the badge man's grin split wide as the muzzle that rose slow to her face. "End of the thread, sweetheart," he hissed, and the click of the hammer sounded like God slamming a coffin shut. The hammer's click still echoed when the night exploded, rifle crack splitting torchlight into shards of fire as the badge man's hat blew clean off his skull, blood misting against smoke in a crimson veil, and Clara didn't think. She moved, teeth bared, knife flashing from her fist into the thigh of the brute pinning her ankle, the blade biting deep until his roar ripped the dark raw. He pitched sideways, boots thrashing slush, and she tore free on knees that burned like brands as the scout barreled out of shadow with murder riding his shoulders, rifle swung like an axe to crush a skull into the snow where it steamed black under torch glare. Another man lunged, shotgun yawning like a wolf's maw, but the scout rolled under the spit of flame, came up inside his breath, and opened his throat in one clean arc that hissed hot across Clara's cheek as he spun, shoving her behind him with a snarl carved from smoke and storm. Gunfire ripped the timber wide, sparks vomiting from trunks, bullets whining like bees drunk on blood, and the hollow drowned in chaos. Men shouting, snow churning red under boots as torches reeled wild in the fists of the dying. Clara's pulse roared like river ice breaking, her knife slippery in a grip gone slick with gore, and when a shadow lunged from behind, she didn't scream. She drove steel into the gut hard enough to feel cartilage crunch, wrenched free, and struck again until his breath blew sour in her hair and his weight folded boneless at her knees. The scout's voice tore through the howl like raw iron. "Move!" She staggered to him, skirts heavy with blood and frost, as his last bullet spat fire and dropped a man whose eyes still glittered when they froze open. Silence slammed down, sudden, thick as tar, broken only by the spit of dying flames and the wheeze of wind dragging smoke through the pines. Clara's breath scoured her throat raw as she turned slow through the wreck. Bodies sprawled like split timber, torches bleeding orange halos into snow black with secrets. And in the center stood the badge man, still upright, shotgun hanging limp from a hand slick with his own blood, grin carved wide as the gash sluicing down his jaw. "You think this ends here?" His voice crawled out like a snake from a skull, cold and cracking, eyes fever-bright under the ruin of his hat. "Burn the dress, bride. Tear the seam. Won't matter. Paper's ash, but ink rides wind, and what you wear, hell, girl. It's carved into tongues by now." The scout moved like thunder rolling, knife reversed in his fist, but the badge man laughed once, low, choking, and swung the shotgun up in a snap as wild as a broken oath. Clara didn't think, didn't pray. She hurled herself into the breach with a scream ripped from her marrow, hands clawing steel, the blast roaring so close it skinned her breath, heat and smoke vomiting skyward as men and trees and law came apart in a flash bright enough to blind God. The world came back in shards of sound and fire, smoke dragging like torn veils across the snow, while Clara clawed her way out of the blast crater on hands raw and bleeding, ears screaming with a shrill whine that drowned the crackle of flames and the groans of dying men. Her lungs gulped air fouled with powder and blood, the taste bitter as iron ground to dust. And when her vision steadied through the swirl of black, she saw him, the scout, sprawled against a split trunk, his braid scorched, his shoulder pouring heat-dark blood that steamed where it hit the frost. The badge man lay twisted in a sprawl of ruin 10 paces off, one arm gone to ragged pulp, his grin split in a rictus grin that still seemed to sneer, even with half his face burned to bone. Clara crawled through wreckage on knees that cut against ice, her fingers slipping in gore and grit as she reached the scout, seized his coat, and dragged with everything left in her marrow until his boots carved trenches deep enough to fill with ghosts. He stirred once, a grunt grinding from his throat like gravel turned by flood, and his eyes, black fire smoldering under a sky streaked with smoke, caught hers with a grip stronger than bone. You alive? She rasped. Her voice flayed raw, and he bared teeth in something that might have been a laugh if not strangled by blood. For now, he croaked. But the world ain't done hunting. His hand shot up sudden, clutching her wrist hard enough to brand sinew into flesh, and he dragged her close, words spitting hot against her ear. Did you rip it? Did you tear the seam? Clara froze. Fingers flying to the bodice where the mended line still cut like a scar over her ribs, her pulse slamming against it like a prisoner on bars. No, she whispered, voice trembling as ash sifted down like gray snow, and his breath hitched. Relief or rage, she couldn't tell, before his head sagged back against the blackened bark. Good, he rasped, because if it tears before I say we ain't fighting men no more, we're fighting fire in the sky. A boom groaned low across the horizon then, rolling like iron wheels chewing earth, and her gaze jerked east where a smear of smoke crawled against dawn. The rails, the engines, the steel beast that would swallow half the prairie whole if that treaty bled into the wrong hands. Clara's gut clenched around a terror bigger than bullets, and she fumbled for his knife, sawed strips from her ruined hem, bound his shoulder tight while his breath hissed through teeth gritted like a wolf in a trap. You're not dying here, she spat, fierce as the wind, but his eyes shuttered slow, lids trembling like shutters in a storm, and when they opened again the fever behind them burned like a forge. Bride, he rasped, low and jagged, if I fall you run like sin, but not away. You take that seam to the fire and you don't stop till every word inside is smoke. Promise me. Her throat locked on splinters as the cold bit deep, and the torches guttered low, their flames choking out in a wind that smelled of new blood and old war. And somewhere beyond the trees, through the drag of silence, boots began to drum again. The sound came first. Boots pounding frost in a rhythm too steady for panic, too sure for mercy. And Clara's spine went rigid as the wind pushed their voices through the black timber. Low, jagged laughter, the kind that promised every bone would pay for blood spilled in the hollow. She crouched over the scout, her breath a ragged saw in her throat. One hand pressed hard to the bandage cinched tight against his shoulder as heat bled through her fingers like a river trying to burn free. His eyes slit open at the noise, dark and raw as coal ground under a boot heel, and he jerked his chin toward the east where dawn crawled sick and slow, bruising the horizon with a smear of rust. Go, he rasped, voice cracked like old wood, and when she shook her head sharp enough to cut the air, his hand shot up fast for a dying man and gripped her collar so hard the seam screamed. You tear that treaty to ash before they rip it from you. His breath hitched and hissed, but the steel in his stare could have nailed coffins shut, and something in her broke. The part that thought help might come, that law might bend right, snapped clean under the weight of what burned in those black eyes. She nodded once, a vow bitten deep, then wrenched free as the first torch glare smeared gold across the snow, shadows sliding long and thin like knives. Clara snatched the knife from the ice where blood had blackened it, her fingers slick and cracked, and crawled low through the churned drifts until the roots of the fallen oak spat her into a gash of clearing where the wind ripped smoke into ghost ropes that curled and vanished. Behind her, the scout hauled breath through his teeth and chambered his last round with a sound that carved bone, and the crack that followed split the morning like God throwing a hammer at the sky. A man's scream tore ragged across the pines, boots skidding, voices spitting curses in tongues dirtier than blood, and Clara ran blind through timber scarred with fire, skirt dragging, ribs sawing against the seam where secrets beat like a second heart under silk. Snow clawed her shins, branches scored her face, but she didn't stop, not when a shot sang past and chewed bark into her hair, not when laughter leapt behind her like wolves closing fast. The clearing yawned sudden, a white wound under a sky bruised purple, and in its center a stump smoldered with the ghost of an old fire, cold but hungry enough to remember flame. Clara fell on it. Knife flashing as she ripped the hem, threads screaming loose, the treaty peeking pale through the slit like a bone dragged out of flesh, ink bleeding black across silk slick with her sweat. Her breath came savage as she snatched a torch from the drift and rammed it into the heart of the ember bed, sparks leaping like startled souls, fire crawling slow then wild, hissing when it licked the parchment. She bent low, lips raw, whispering through her teeth like a curse. "Burn, damn you, burn!" The ink blistered, curled, spat smoke sweet as sin, and then the wind split with a voice that froze her blood. "Step away, bride, or I'll stitch your throat shut where you stand." She spun, smoke in her eyes, and through the veil of fire and frost strode the badge man, grinning through the ruin of his face, shotgun cradled like a lover. And behind him, two more shapes, rifles leveled, boots eating the ground in time with her hammering pulse. The torch spat sparks that clawed at her face as Clara jerked upright, the knife slick in her fist, smoke snaking around her like a noose, while the badge man stalked closer with a grin carved into ruin, blood caked black along his jaw, where skin had burned to bone, but his eyes gleamed sharp as fresh steel under the gray bleed of dawn. Behind him the two shadows fanned wide, rifles cocked, muzzles yawning black, and the air tasted like ash and endings. "Step back," he drawled, voice thick as tar and twice as slick, "and maybe I let you breathe till I pull what's sewn inside that pretty seam." Clara's chest sawed for air, her ribs screaming against the fabric that still hugged the secret like a brand, and every nerve in her body shrieked, "Run!" But her feet rooted in blood and frost because if the treaty burned half, the other half lay in her skin, in this silk, in the stitch the scout had pulled tight with sinew and silence. The badge man tilted his head, shotgun rising slow as a gallows hoist, and his laugh slid out like a knife gutting the last hope. "Paper's ash, girl, but power, it don't burn easy. Men'll carve it from you same as beef if they must." His boot crunched closer, firelight skidding over his teeth, and Clara's grip cinched on the knife till bone popped in her wrist. Behind him, a sound cracked the timber, not a twig, but a bullet tearing air, and one of the riflemen spun, throat blooming red as the scout came out of the trees like a wraith clawed from smoke, his body ragged, shirt black with blood, but his aim straight as God's last judgment. He fired again before the second man swung, the blast jerking the rifle out of his claw. And then the scout was on him, blade flashing, snow drinking dark as a scream ripped and cut off clean. Clara lunged through the smoke, the badge man whipping toward her with a roar, shotgun belching fire that tore earth in a geyser of slush, heat kissing her cheek as she slammed low and drove the knife up hard into his belly. The grunt that burst from him was raw and wet, his grin shattering as the blade ripped deeper, but his hands clamped her arms like iron bands and wrenched her up so close she saw hell burning in his eyes. "You burn it now," he rasped, spit and blood stringing his teeth, and the hiss in his throat was a curse clawing skyward. "Won't matter. They'll write more. They'll write in blood." Clara twisted, snarling like something feral, and dragged the knife sideways, feeling muscle tear, heat gush. His roar shredding the morning as the shotgun fell, and his knees caved like rotten beams. She staggered free, breath ripping through her ribs, knife dripping fire-black blood as the scout limped out of the smoke behind her, face carved from stone, eyes fixed on the torch where the treaty curled in flame. "Burn it all," he rasped, and she didn't need telling. She hurled the last scrap into the fire and watched ink scream into smoke that whirled up and broke like wings against the pale sky, and in that breath, just that breath, she thought it was over. Until a shot cracked sharp from the ridge, the torch burst from her fist, and the scout dropped like an anvil in snow, blood blooming redder than dawn as the echo rolled on and on like judgment still coming. The shot still shivered in the air when Clara hit her knees in the snow, breath tearing loose like fabric ripped from a frame, hands clawing through red slush to the scout's body, where blood pulsed hot and black between her fingers, running in ropes that steamed against the frost. His eyes blinked once, slow, heavy as a door sagging on broken hinges, and his mouth curved. Not in pain, not in fear, but in something that cut deeper than both as his voice crawled out, rough and frayed. "Don't! Let it live!" She gripped his face with hands slick as melted wax, her throat raw from wind and smoke, and the words tumbled jagged from her teeth. "No, damn you, no!" But his head sagged like the world had been waiting for this lean of his bones since birth. And rage ignited behind her ribs, with a heat the fire at her back could never touch. She spun, knife flashing, eyes locking on the ridge where the shooter stood, a gaunt silhouette haloed in smoke, rifle crooked casual as a gambler's grin, and her boots chewed the frost in a dead sprint, lungs clawing air like knives as the man chambered slow, too sure, too late. Clara hit him like storm iron, the blade driving up with a scream that shredded her throat, ripped through his gut, tore hot across her knuckles, and she didn't stop, didn't breathe, didn't blink until his breath choked wet and the whites of his eyes went blind under a sky split wide with dawn. She staggered back, slick to the elbows, chest hammering like hooves across hollow ground, and stumbled down the slope to where the fire hissed low, the treaty ash curling like gray tongues in the drift. She snatched what scraps lived, flung them deeper into the flames till they wept into smoke, and dropped beside the scout as the wind dragged the last black thread of night off the earth. His breath fluttered faint as a moth wing against her wrist when she slid his head into her lap, her tears cutting clean rivers through the soot on his face, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to the rasp of his name on her lips, to the weight of his hand curling slow and weak against hers. "Thread holds," he whispered, ghost thin, and the words sank through her bones like nails before his fingers slackened, and his eyes dimmed under a sky clawed open by pale fire. Clara sat until the torches died, until the snow quit drinking blood and only silence rode the trees, and when she rose, her skirts dragged like chains across the crimson crust. She took the knife, took the rifle, took the seam burned black into memory and walked east where the sun bled light over a land that had feasted on too many vows. Behind her, smoke climbed like a ghost in chains, and in its curling spine the last promise of the West burned down to a whisper. "What they tear, I mend. What they break, I guard, even if the thread runs red to the end of the sky."